Bien, alors on va reprendre la suite de nos ateliers avec, on va écouter là maintenant Sara Farris qui va nous présenter l'atelier sur le thème de migration et fémonationalisme. Alors Sara Farris travaille à l'Université de Londres et est membre du comité éditorial de Historical Materialism et elle a publié tout récemment le livre que vous voyez affiché à l'écran derrière moi, In the Name of Women's Rights, The Rise of Femonationalism. Elle travaille sur des questions plus généralement de care, de migration, notamment de migration féminine, et sur le sujet de l'intersectionnalité. Le livre que vous voyez affiché derrière moi, qui va reprendre, dont elle va nous parler essentiellement dans sa présentation, n'a pas encore été traduit en français. Par contre, vous pouvez trouver sur Contretemps un certain nombre d'articles qu'elle a rédigés qui reprennent une partie des concepts principaux. Si ça vous intéresse de les développer, vous pouvez trouver là quelques informations rédigées en français. Sinon, le livre, évidemment, est en anglais et peut être acheté facilement. Je propose à Sara d'aller sur sa présentation qui reviendra donc sur le thème du fémonationalisme qu'elle a développé, l'idée de comment l'extrême droite prétend s'intéresser au féminisme et porter un axe de ce combat.
Okay, so yes, yes, because first of all, thanks so much for inviting me to this conference. I'm really happy to be here, and it's been really energizing for me to be here also because I've just had the baby you see in the room is mine, and it's been an experiment to come here to a feminist conference with a little baby. And I'm really happy to see it's actually working because I have all these wonderful comrades here and women helping. So it's been great also to be able to come back after a few months of maternity to discuss all these issues. So it's to a great feminist conference. Thank you. So I really want to discuss, as Aude already said, some of the themes that I lay out in this book. You see the cover here. Or maybe I should move a little bit, on Femonationalism. I want to begin by telling you a little bit what prompted me to write this book in the first place. So it was in 2011 when I was living in Germany, and with some colleagues I organized a conference on the mobilization of feminist ideas by the right wing. In 2011, it was the time when Jasbir Puar's book on homonationalism had just it appeared. It was published just a few years earlier. And it was very important because it opened up a wide and important conversation on what she called the collusions between the gay and LGBT movement in the United States and American nationalism and Islamophobia. So in Europe, a number of political analysts, feminist scholars, and sociologists were also wondering how is that far right-wing parties are trying to convince us that they care about women's rights and that they want to fight Islam in order to defend those rights. So how can we believe these parties? How is it possible that they are suddenly becoming, they claim to be feminist parties? So here I just have this PowerPoint because I think it's important also to support my arguments by showing you a few slides, a few images. This is from the Northern League, that, remember, is the country in the governing Italy at the moment. And this is from a few years ago. And it was, this is a poster that's been made against the entrance of Turkey into Europe. And the message is very, very clear. As you can see, it says, if we allow a country with a Muslim majority like Turkey to enter Europe, this is what's going to happen to our women. From all these, liberated professional women, we are just going to have veiled women in cages. So this is the narrative that most of the right-wing parties are developing. So as someone who had worked for several years on issues of female migration and especially stereotypes and representations of migrant and Muslim women in Europe, I was very interested in all these questions. And in particular, I wanted to understand these so-called rescue narratives that right-wing parties, but also neoliberals and some feminists I have to say, we're using when addressing Muslim and immigrant communities. And the rescue narratives basically are those that claim we, right-wing parties, neoliberals, and some feminists, we are here to rescue Muslim women, to save them from these bad Muslim men or immigrant men that really oppress them. But also, my interest for this theme was really because I had been working for many years, especially on issues of migration, female migration, and care work, which is the work that's done by most of migrant women in Europe. But also, as a Marxist feminist and someone who is also very interested in social reproduction feminism and who works on social reproduction feminism, I also wanted to see whether we could identify a political economic logic behind these saving or rescue narratives. And I wanted to explore whether this sudden stigmatization of Muslim and migrant men in the name of women's rights also had something to do with the position of Muslim and migrant women in the economic arena. So I wanted to see if there was some economic reason also, material reason behind this sudden interest by far right-wing parties for these women. So that's how I really began to work on these issues. In the time I have left, I want to tell you something about the main arguments I present in this book, and especially I will focus, as you will see, on this political economic logic that I think underpins this, what I call Femonationalism. This is another, very quickly, just to give you some more examples about right-wing parties claiming to be for women's rights. This is Marine Le Pen saying, all these migrants, the beginning of the migrant crisis signals the beginning of the end of women's rights. So again, an anti-feminist claiming to be feminist. And this is again from Italy. This is a website that collects all crimes by migrants. And it's been sponsored especially by Salvini. And when you see the crimes, the majority of crimes that they list are rape and sexual harassment and sexual abuse, domestic violence. And here, very clearly, again, the idea is this woman is an Italian woman, and she's been, as you can see, she's been a victim of violence because her husband or partner is called Ahmed. Obviously, that's her problem. She's married to a Muslim man. So I really already said that. One of the things I really try to investigate really is also the participation of feminists in these femonationalist convergences, because it is not only right-wing parties and it's not just neoliberals, as I will say, but also there are some quite prominent feminists who actually have in many ways supported these ideas that Islam in particular and non-Western cultures more generally are particularly patriarchal and dangerous for women. One of the most prominent examples is Elisabeth Badinter. One of the reasons why I use this example is also because my book focuses on France, Italy, and the Netherlands, and Badinter is probably one of the most well-known examples of these Femonationalist feminists. Here she says, I read it quickly, this is something she said when she was asked to comment by the Commission Jury to what was her opinion about forbidding the burqa in public spaces. So it was before 2010. And she says, of course you need to forbid the burqa in public spaces because it's against women. But, I mean, she especially describes, this is the way in which she describes the women who wear the burqa. She says, in this possibility of being looked at without being seen, and to look at the other without him or her being able to see you, so she's talking about women with a full veil, she says, I see the satisfaction of a triple perverse enjoyment, the enjoyment of one's supremacy over the other, the enjoyment of the exhibitionist, and the enjoyment of the voyeur. I think we are dealing with very sick women, and I do not think that we have to be determined according to their pathology. So she thinks that fundamentally the women with the burqa are the ones who are doing some kind of violence towards those who see them, and they are fundamentally sick. They describe them as psycho. So the peculiar encounter, the book really is about this convergence that I'm describing between the right wing, the neoliberals, and these feminists. This is a peculiar encounter between anti-Islam agendas and the emancipatory rhetoric of women's rights. Is not restricted to nationalists and feminists. As I said, there are also neoliberals involved, and I want to say a little bit more about this. So neoliberal advocates who are otherwise anti-nationalist, or they claim to be, have also increasingly deployed anti-Islam representations in the name of women's rights. And a good example of these are the so-called civic integration programs for third country nationals, which are, as I will explain, a landmark of neoliberalism. So these programs are designed to foster the inclusion of migrants into the fabric of European societies, but actually they have made the migrants' long-term residency dependent upon a certified commitment to learn the language, the culture and the values of the destination country. They urge migrants both to acknowledge women's rights as a central value of the West and to assimilate to Western cultural practices which are presented as more civilizationally advanced. So here I'm talking about, I don't know if you have these in Switzerland, but civic integration programs are those programs basically that require newcoming migrants to learn the language of the country in which they move and to also acquire a number of skills and to know the values and the history of the country. So it works differently in different countries. But in France, for example, and I have an example from France, in France, for example, it works that migrants have to go to an office, they are exposed to videos in which, to documentaries kind of, that talk about life in France, and so how they should behave if they want to be truly integrated into French society. But what is particularly interesting about these civic integration programs is that they are obsessed with women's rights. So they all say, if you want to integrate in this country, you really need to demonstrate that you respect women's rights. So the assumption, obviously, is that these men, especially men, because they are non-Western, they don't know what women's rights are, so they need to be taught about women's rights. And this extract is from one of the materials that were used in the civic integration programs in France, and they talk about equality between men and women. I'm not going to read it. It was just to give you a little example and to say that actually equality between men and women is so prominent in these materials that it comes alongside laïcité, that, as you know, it's such a pillar of the Republic. What's interesting, though, from my point of view, and I think what I want to highlight is not so much the emphasis upon women's rights, which is a positive thing in many ways. We're not complaining that they say women's rights are important, respect for gender equality is important. The problem is, one of the problems at least, is the huge contradictions that come with this. Is first the assumption that migrants do not know what women's rights are, but secondly is also the huge contradictions that go with it, because these states and these policies in the end do not really respect women's rights, especially migrant women's rights. But I will talk a little bit more about this later. So in light of this, so this very strange convergence, right? You see the right nationalists, Marine Le Pen, Salvini, Badinter, the neoliberals, preparing these documents and talking about women's rights. So what is all of this? So in light of all these mess, in a way, these kind of very weird convergences, so the question I explore in my book are, why are these different movements invoking the same trope, the same ideas, and identifying Muslim men as one of the most dangerous threats to Western societies? Are we witnessing the rise of a new unholy alliance, or is this seeming consensus across the political spectrum mainly coincidental and contingent? And finally, why are Muslim women being presented with offers of emancipation and rescue in a context of rising Islamophobia and anti-immigration sentiments, particularly regarding employment and welfare? So in order to answer these questions and to frame the political economic logic underpinning this unexpected convergence among different political agendas, I have coined this term, which is femonationalism. So femonationalism is short for feminist and femocratic nationalism, and it refers both to the exploitation of feminist themes by nationalists and neoliberals in anti-Islam, but also anti-immigration campaigns, and to the participation of certain feminists and femocrats in the stigmatization of Muslim men under the banner of gender equality. Femonationalism thus describes, on the one hand, the attempts of Western European right-wing parties and neoliberals to advance xenophobic and racist politics through the touting of gender equality, while on the other hand, it captures the involvement of various well-known and quite visible feminists and femocrats in the current framing of Islam as a quintessentially misogynistic religion and culture. So in this presentation, I want to suggest that femonationalism must be understood as an ideology that springs from a specific mode of encounter, or what I prefer to call a convergence, amongst the different political projects, and that is produced by and productive of a specifically economic logic. So the next part of this presentation is really devoted to clarifying especially one key dimension of femonationalism, which is why I call femonationalism as a neoliberal political economy. I'm not going to discuss much why I call it a convergence, but I'm happy to say that maybe it comes up in the Q&A. So why it's a specific neoliberal political economy? So as I said at the outset, there are very few studies that have tried to explore the political economic foundations of these ideological convergences. So there are few studies have attempted to take into account the political economic dimensions of the turn to gender and gay equality by conservative, neoliberal, or racist politics, by referring mainly to neoliberalism as a type of background force. And for example, here Sirma Bilge, who is a Canadian feminist who works on intersectionality, she thinks that the possibility for gender and sexuality to become what she calls the operation field of racist and imperialist nationalism is mainly due to their fittingness with the neoliberal mode of hiding structural inequalities behind cultural conflicts. So there are authors who have tried to understand the political economic logic of femonationalism. They don't call it femonationalism, they call it sexual nationalism or homonationalism in the case of concerns with LGBTQ movement. So they tried, but my feeling is that they try to understand this phenomenon mostly as an external one. So, for example, in the case of Sirma Bilge, she fundamentally thinks that this is possible because neoliberalism has created these different niches, including market niches, including the market niches of gay rights, for example, in which these civil rights or women's rights or gay rights are reduced basically to consumption ideas. So it's possible to have, for instance, to go to the nightclubs for gay rights, or to buy a certain brand of clothes that is specifically, which is specifically addressed to the gay community and so forth. So she thinks this is possible because neoliberalism has reduced these rights to fundamentally market niches. I think this is, I agree with that. I don't disagree necessarily. I think it's a very important aspect of how neoliberalism, how can we say, has in a way co-opted these rights and these ideas. But I think these analyses do not go far enough and do not explain too much why are we witnessing specifically this convergence between feminists and far right-wing parties, especially on anti-Islam campaigns. So I really want to argue here, I say this, I have a slide on this, maybe I'll read it. I think these studies treat neoliberalism as this, what I call the economic theater of operation for the encounter between this different array of forces, but not as one of the main characters on stage. So I agree that neoliberalism is central, but I argue that it's not simply a contextual ground, but it's itself constitutive of such a convergence. And here I want to give you an example. So really the main example is what I very briefly talked about before, which is the civic integration policies for third country nationals. So these policies are extremely important because they bear witness to the participation of neoliberals in the stigmatization of Muslim and immigrants in the name of women's rights, and because they are a powerful reminder that femonationalism is not just a free-floating discourse confined to the media, but it is concretely translated into actual policies. So as I was saying before, these policies require migrants to learn what are the history, the values, and the language of the countries in which they move. And I already said that gender equality here is presented as very important. They say, we are so much into gender equality, and you migrant, you Muslim, you need to learn this. Okay. We should note, however, that all the civic integration policies are not exclusively about culture. So they are not just cultural policies, trying to teach migrants the language or the culture and history of the hosting countries, it's called. But it's very important to understand also the more economic aspects of these policies, especially with the establishment in 2007 of the European Integration Fund. We have seen all across Europe a number of initiatives being developed in order to have the funds of these, in order to have the money from this integration fund. So basically, one of the aims of this European Integration Fund is to provide money, to give material resources to programs, to associations, NGOs, and programs more generally that help especially migrant women to integrate economically in order to find a job. Migrant women are not the only target of these programs, to be clear, but they are a very important target because in these programs you can see that they have lots of statistical data telling you that migrant women are more unemployed in comparison to non-migrant women, and so it's important that they are basically employed, that they find a job. More or less explicitly, these lower status the lower rates of participation of women in the workplace, of these migrant women in their workplace, are in fact attributed to their supposedly backward cultural backgrounds, which are deemed responsible for keeping them at home. So fundamentally, these civic integration policies say, okay, migrant and Muslim women are less employed than non-migrant women, and this is basically because they come from families and from cultures that do not encourage women to work. They are patriarchal families and patriarchal cultures, and really they want to keep women at home, to look after children, to look after the elderly people, and to just look after the houses. This is really the narrative, implicitly or explicitly. Now, because of that, one of the what maybe I should say, I didn't explain clearly enough, that one of the reasons why the civic integration policies is really deeply neoliberal is because it brings together immigration policies and workfare policies. Because the reason why these policies, these integration programs so much want to put migrant women to work. It's not because, they really care that much about, the emancipation of migrant women. This is at least my claim. But it's also because they are framed within the so-called Europe 2020 strategy, which is that strategy that basically put the aim of having 75% of the working age population at work by 2020. And the migrant population is key to this target. And these are classical workfare policies. The idea is if you are able, you need to work, and if you don't, you are not going to get social benefits. So it's basically, this is increasingly going on all across Europe. It's a kind of blackmailing of workers, really, that they need to accept that jobs that are available in order to be able to claim social benefits, or in order to have a job, to have unemployment benefits, etc. So this is really what's happening also with these civic integration policies. They increasingly are targeting migrant women, and they are increasingly basically telling them, you need to find a job. It's you probably are not working because you are from a backward family or background, but it's important that you find a job to emancipate yourself. And this is something that I really looked in very much detail in the book on this. And I want to give you again the example of France, which I think can be quite interesting for you. So in France, since 2009, the law on migrants integration has established what they call in French, it's called, apologies for my bad French, bilan de compétences professionnelles. So it's a professional portfolio, basically. And this is an obligatory requirement for all those who sign these, who go into these integration programs. So basically this means that all these new migrants, not only they have to go to courses to learn French, not only they have to go to courses to learn about the history and the values of French society, but they also need to go to these offices and they need to develop their portfolio. So basically they are helped to do their own CV. And they are also helped to find a job in different ways, depending on also on their age. So according to official statistics, in 2012, almost 60% of all those who started the civic integration programs and were provided with a professional portfolio were women. So women are the majority of those who are obliged to do these professional portfolios. And the implementation of this portfolio was presented to the French public as a way of promoting the integration of migrants, and especially migrant women, according to the idea that employment is very important to integrate into society. But what's interesting for me, I really want to go to this, what are the jobs that these women found? When we look specifically at the type of economic integration that was promoted by these civic integration programs, in reality we find very few jobs. So the majority of women doing these integration programs usually work as elderly carers, so they care for elderly people, they are nannies, they are babysitters, they are cleaners, they clean hotels, they are cleaners in private households, and so forth. So it's really all what those jobs that we call the social reproductive jobs. And this for me was particularly illuminating, if you want, in a way, because it was quite clear that this is a huge contradiction, particularly for all those feminists that are promoting this type of civic integration and economic integration. One of the things that I should say, in fact, is that many of these civic integration programs, economic integration programs, are being implemented by feminist or women's associations. So, for example, there is a famous association which is based in Bordeaux, but is also in other cities in France, which is called Promo Femmes, and they are this is one of the organizations that is organizing, for instance, these care courses for these migrant women. So in order to teach them how to become carers, either elderly care or domestic workers, and so forth. So I think it's quite important to notice this huge contradiction for the feminists, who are on the one hand attacking Muslims and non-Western migrants for being in fact backward and patriarchal and oppressive towards women, but on the other hand, when you look specifically at the type of integration that they encourage, they're basically pushing these women into all those jobs that the feminist movement fought against in the 1970s. So the feminist movement wanted precisely to liberate, in many ways, women from gender roles and from the confinement of women within the segregation of gender jobs. But at the same time, these women now are pushing Muslim women and migrant women precisely into those tasks and into those jobs. So this is, I think, a huge contradiction, a huge problem that we need to face, to confront, and I think to criticize. But I think it's important here also to perhaps to mention the active role of right-wing parties and right-wing governments, because what I said at the beginning, how is it possible that right-wing parties are so much against immigration, but they seem to be, in a way, they seem to close an eye when it comes to migrant women, or even they claim to be they want to save Muslim women when they say we need to liberate these women. So again, this is not just rhetoric. It's not just a discourse, that they do for the media and just in order to stigmatize Muslim men. Actually, again, this is very much this is actually happening in practice. So to give you an example again, from Italy this time, at the end of the 2000s, so in 2009, between 2009 and 2010, there was a mass regularization in Italy because, as you might know, Italy has been a country for many reasons that really in which there were no clear immigration policies until the 2000s, but there were waves of regularization of illegal migrants. So in 2010, so in the midst of the global financial crisis, all across Europe and all across the world, as you certainly know, there were lots of, there was an exacerbation, if you want, of anti-immigration slogans and anti-immigration politics. And one of the reasons was we are in the midst of an economic crisis, people are losing their jobs, therefore we don't want any more migrants because we don't need them. We have a national supply of people, and also these migrants really are taking jobs from the natives. They ask for lower wages, and they do these jobs for lower salary and so forth. So in the midst of all of this, it was the Berlusconi government when they were saying we don't want any more migrants. We need to face this crisis by relying on Italian labor power. In the midst of all of this, the Berlusconi government actually regularized hundreds of thousands of migrant women. And the reason was that they did that because all these migrant women in Italy worked as badanti, which means carers, especially elderly carers. But also they actually justified that, and they said, of course, we don't want to regularize those who rob a villa or who rape women. But certainly we need to be, we will behave differently, and we want to actually maintain those workers who do this important work for our families. So the reason actually is double. That the interesting thing is that even the voters of the Lega Nord, who are the Northern League, who are absolutely anti-immigration, they were very willing to accept migrant women. And the reason is not only that, and the reason is not just that these women, because they are women, they play into an imaginary according to which they are less dangerous than men, but it's also because so many voters of the Northern League, middle-class voters, they actually employ these women, and they are very content of having this cheap labor rather than having actually to pay proper wage to these women, or which would be the left-wing option, to claim actually public and universal elderly care. So in that sense, it was actually quite easy for the Northern League to say we are anti-immigration, but migrant women is another story. So all in all, what I really want to say, and I'm concluding here because I feel I'm speaking too much, and maybe there can be, I hope there will be questions. What I want to say here, I mean, in very, very briefly, I think this book really tries to, I say lots of things that lots of people already said. Especially in France, if you look at the work, for example, of Françoise Vergès, or the work of Christine Delphi, Stella Belkacem, you pronounce, etc. So I'm talking about these feminists because I refer to their work, and their work has been important for me, and many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with their work. But this is also to say, they say lots of things that I say, and they said before me. So what I really try to bring, if you want, as a novelty here, and something that I wish was more discussed, is that all these issues really have an economic foundation, and this is not discussed enough in my view. So I think it's important to understand, and here I really conclude, that there is a double standard between migrant men and migrant women. So migrant men and migrant women and Muslim women are perceived differently. The first, the men as the danger, as the sexual predators and the sexual threat, and the women as the victims, as those who need to be saved. And I think this double standard is important to acknowledge, not only because we need to understand the different nuances and forms of racism, because there are two forms of racism, equally. Even when we victimize migrant women, this is a form of racism. We're not doing them. There is not we, sorry, but there is not any favor done to them when they are, saved or claiming to be emancipated. So there is a long discussion in the book that I really am very passionate about, which is to understand what is the sexualization of racism and the racialization of sexism. It's a bit convoluted as words, but basically it's the idea that we need to understand how sexism is racialized. So usually sexism is presented as something that belongs always to the Muslim and the non-Western communities, but also that racism is sexualized, which means that also racism works differently for men and women when it targets men and when it targets women. And the other thing I want to say is that this double standard also needs to be understood through a political economic lens, because it is precisely because these women play such an important role in our economies in Europe that there are all these talks about saving them and emancipating them. There is really somehow this call for integrating these women and nationalizing or assimilating these women, precisely because Europe is facing not only this aging crisis and this welfare crisis, but really it's a crisis of care and a crisis of social reproduction. So I'll close here. Actually, one of the things that I want to work more in the future is, which I think speaks to what you said, is the way in which colonialism itself is important to understand the destruction of women's rights in the colonies. And there is the work of the late Saba Mahmood, for example, who, maybe you know, she died last year, unfortunately. She was an anthropologist who worked of Egyptian origin, and she worked especially on the ways in which British colonialism, for instance, is the one actually that has created Sharia law, that has created this distinction between family law on the one hand and private economic law on the other hand. And Saba Mahmood is not the only one who is arguing this, but basically the argument is that it's precisely this separation that has completely re-articulated and destroyed the customs that used to be used within these societies, that actually has created these distinctions between and this separation in laws concerning marriage and so forth. So basically the suggestion here is that Sharia, for instance, is not a Muslim invention, but is a Western invention. And we need to look at the ways in which colonialism has in fact in a way made impossible for many Muslim women to find ways for self-emancipation. Because I think we all agree here, the point is not to deny that there is oppression of women in many countries with Muslim majorities. No one is denying that. There is not to say that patriarchy obviously is also found within Muslim communities. I mean, I don't think we want to deny that, and I think it can be it can be found in all other communities. I just don't think there is anything particularly special about Muslim patriarchy. The point is really, in my view, from especially here in Europe, to understand how we can in fact support the struggle for self-emancipation of migrant women like all other women. And my problem with these femonationalist accounts is that I think it makes that struggle for self-emancipation much more difficult, because Muslim women are constantly, for instance Muslim women, but also non-Western women, are constantly confronted with the need to justify themselves. And they find themselves in that dilemma that many African American women, for example, found themselves in the 1960s, in the 1970s, and still now. And there are lots of books written about this, which is when you live in a society that continuously attack you as an African American, as a black person, or as a Muslim, like now, it's really difficult to also fight patriarchy, because you are constantly required, on the one hand, to defend your community against racism, but on the other hand, you also need to defend yourself and other women for patriarchy within that community. And this becomes a very problematic situation, and it creates lots of, as you can imagine, incredibly problematic and short-circuit situations, and sometimes also it leads to even more conservatism in these communities, and even more act of resistance. Like one of the things that it's been noticed is that for many women now in France, but I see this also in the United Kingdom, many more young women are actually using the veil and putting the veil on because they are proud and they want to claim, this is my identity, and I actually this is my way of saying I don't want your Islamophobia. So this is just to say I agree with you. To answer your question, yes, you're right, civic integration programs are only for legal migrants, and they were designed especially for, in a way they were designed especially for migrant women, because they were addressed initially to migrants coming to these countries for family reunification. And so the idea was that basically that it was important to assimilate especially these women coming for family reunification. And one of the reasons, maybe I should say this because this is really important, one of the reasons they were obsessed with the assimilation of migrant women and Muslim women is because these women are mothers who are raising the second generation of migrants. And so the idea is we need to make sure that these women raise the children with French values, Dutch values, Italian values, or Swiss values, whatever they are. To give you a very, very, very little example, I think it's quite illuminating though. You might remember the riots, the so-called riots in France in 2005. And at that time, Sarkozy, one of the things he said was that the reason why there were so many second and third generation young people involved in the riots in the banlieue was because they belonged to polygamic families. So the reason is that they belonged to anomic families in which there were no clear rules, there were too many mothers, and fundamentally they were not raised in a French way. So if you want to, I think this is really important to understand. They are addressing these women also because they are the present or future mothers of these new citizens, and that's something that's concerning these right-wing nationalists very much. What you said about Tunisia and the articulation of these struggles, also if I understood you correctly, I think it's in a way it answers a little bit what I told her. It's very difficult to articulate these different struggles, and I think this global Islamophobia is obviously making all of this much more difficult because it confronts these movements to make continuous tactical choices about what they can do, and is making certainly the work of feminists much more difficult. So, I mean, again, I think it was also a comment, I agree. And your question, yes, this is what I try to also explain in the book. I think what I try to say is that Muslim women at the moment are what I call a synecdoche for the image of the woman, the non-migrant woman, as a victim. Now, this is what I mean by this. When you look at the history of the ways in which migrant women have been treated in Europe, first of all, I'm really talking from a European perspective. I'm looking at the ways in which these phenomena have developed in Europe. I'm not looking at other countries. I don't have the competence to do that. I'm really looking at Europe. So when you look at the history of how migrant women have been treated and perceived and represented in Europe, you see this pattern very, very clearly. They were always portrayed as victims. So, for example, until I would say until the end of the 1990s, there were lots of talk about women, especially Eastern European women, in the sex industry as the victims of the sex industry. So there were lots of campaigns to liberate these women because there was the idea of the trafficked women, victims of prostitution, victims of their pimps, etc. So again, they were very much victimized. Now, in the last 10, 15 years, there are lots of studies that demonstrate that many of these women, they actually, this is a very complicated discussion, but many of them were not victims of traffic. They actually, they started working as sex workers, and many of them also chose to work as sex workers. So lots of studies actually show that the trafficking dimension, which is present, I don't want to deny that for sure, but was actually much less prominent than all these campaigns showed. So actually these studies show lots of women, in many ways, decided to do sex work, sometimes because it paid much better than working as a waitress in a restaurant. And so for them it was, for some of them was sometimes easier. Obviously, when we talk about sex work, there's such a moralization of the issue that it's very hard to discuss all of this. But this is just to say that migrant women were always perceived as victims. In the 1980s, when there are lots of migrants from North Africa, for example, I'm talking about Italy in particular here. When you look at the sociological studies done in those years, there was very much a discussion, these women are moving from tradition to modernity. So the idea was that migration actually was a liberating process for them, because they were going from a backward country in North Africa in North Africa or another part of the global South, really, into a emancipated modern country. So this is a little bit to answer your question. On the one hand, I think there is this continuity in the idea that non-Western women are victims, whether they are victim of the sex industry and sex traffic and victim of patriarchal societies because they are non-Western, or victims of Islam. On the other hand, I do agree there is a specificity to the ways in which Muslim women are represented. And I think the specificity also has to do with really with the current war on terror, the ways also in which, especially because of the conflicts in the Middle East, obviously the whole situation of Muslims is being rearticulated also in Europe. So there are certainly specificities. And one of the specificities I think which is more and more visible in the last few years, I would say more and more after I wrote the book, is that many Muslim women are in a way less and less perceived as victims. In the sense that there is still the victimization, the victim image, but on the other hand, there is increasingly also the idea that these women actually are a bit dangerous and they need to be kept under check, they need to be controlled, they need to be unveiled, so they need to take the burqas off because that burqa maybe hides a weapon, or they need to be kept under control because many young Muslim women are fleeing to Syria or were fleeing to Syria to join ISIS. So I would say that the discourse is also shifting. There are changes that are going on. Although I still think that the idea that they are victims is still dominant. And to conclude on this, I also think that this idea that they are victims is very central to the type of jobs also that they do. But what brings all these non-Western women together, whether Muslims, Latin Americans, Eastern Europeans, and so forth, is that they are all working in social reproduction. So, yeah.
Merci. On va reprendre une salle de questions.
But thanks, really important. Yeah, and the first one that you asked me about, I mean, I think I agree with you, it was more a comment in a way. I think it's true. I think it's also more true in, let me use this term, continental Europe, because in a way, where I live in London, in the United Kingdom, I experience another type of difficulty. It's not so difficult to talk about political economy, even in Marxist terms, and it is also not difficult to acknowledge the need for an intersectional analysis and to recognize the need also of intersectional feminism, the race and racism, etc. These are not the difficulties I see so much in the UK, for example, but there are other types of difficulties, which is in a way the fact that there is a fragmentation of struggles. So, and also in a way the fact that you speak a Marxist lexicon or you talk about political economy, okay, who cares? You're not in charge of anything in a way. So you can, I mean, in a way, this is one of the interesting things about these more liberal countries. There is not a problem in the UK of asking Muslim women to take the headscarf off, for example. So this is not something that we see there. On the other hand, this does not mean that Muslim women are not discriminated or that not racialized and so forth. It's just a different articulation of these struggles, I would say. But yes, I totally agree with you. In some ways, I think, especially because I'm from Italy originally, and I know how difficult it is in the academia, but not only in the academia, to talk about political economy and race and racism. So I think it's important to, I mean, maybe this also speaks to what he said a little bit, because he said, we can't just apply this mechanical political economic understanding. I agree, and I hope my intervention didn't come through as there's just economically deterministic Marxism that everything needs to be explained with political economy. This was not my aim, and it's definitely not the aim of the book, because I actually try to understand because I don't think I managed too much, because I think it's so difficult, but I think it's really important to understand the interconnection between all these dimensions and elements. The cultural one is absolutely crucial. The historical one, I use a lot post-colonial feminism, for example, to understand why nationalists are especially interested in women. So this is not so much about political economy. This has so much to do with colonialism, the history of colonialism, the colonial legacies. It has so much to do with psychology and psychoanalysis to understand, I mean, how these racialization, the racialization of women and these Muslim women and they play into certain colonial subconscious and imagery. So I really don't want to reduce all of these to the political economy. I mean, it's a long discussion what we mean by political economy, but in any case, just to say, I just thought for a 25-30 minutes talk, I wanted to go straight to the thing that I say, the one thing new that I try to say, and this is really the reason. But obviously there are lots of other things going on. So there was another question, which is what you said. I agree. I mean, I think also here it depends on different countries, on different contexts. But I agree with you. I see this especially in the last, I would say, 10 years, that these Muslim women are, I think there is still the victimization paradigm, I think it's still dominant, but I think it's not exclusive, for sure. I do think you're right. Muslim women are also increasingly portrayed as dangerous. And in a way, even in the case in which they are portrayed as victims, the other side is always that they are dangerous. I mean, it's a very complex, there are many nuances to these arguments and these discourses, because in many ways I think these Muslim women are represented and perceived as the Troy horse of these cultures, because they are really coming into Europe, and because they are so key to the socialization of the second generations, they are definitely dangerous, because they can also, educate their children into being bad citizens. So, but at the same time, there are many articulations of this discourse. They are victims, they are dangerous, they need to be saved, they need to be saved from themselves, but they also need to be saved, so we say, us from them. It's a very complicated discourse with lots of nuances. So I don't really want to reduce it to one side, because I don't think it reflects what's going on. I think it's important to acknowledge also the contradictions between these various articulations. Oh yeah, you are asking me who cleans, who washes my socks. Actually, I don't do it myself. My washing machine does. But I don't, if the question was if I have a cleaner, no. But I want to say something here, because I think it's also, I will say more about this during the plenary, but I think it's also important not to demonize the women who have a cleaner, or who actually ask some, who have also a migrant cleaner. I don't think that the way here is to say, oh, you're a bad feminist, or you're a bad woman because you employ a migrant woman to wash your socks, for example. Because the reality is that the system, precisely because there are these huge contradictions, very often leaves many women with no other choice. And why I'm saying this? And I think especially about childcare and the women who, because one could say, when it comes to cleaning, perhaps we should make more of an effort to share tasks with a partner, right? So in a way, I can see this argument more in that case. But what about childcare, in which if you're a couple both working, and it doesn't mean that you are middle class or rich, what do you do about childcare? Lots of women need to have babysitters, and sometimes these babysitters are migrant women, and sometimes they hire migrant women because they ask less money. But I don't feel like putting the blame on the couple that needs to hire a babysitter, because they are themselves, in a way, the victims of a situation in which the state does not provide any public and universal care, in which salaries are increasingly shrinked, and so it's actually hard to hire, for example, a babysitter with full protection, because it's extremely expensive. I was looking, for example, into this personally, also as a personal experience. I wanted to think of, because, I guess it also depends. I think there are different experiences in different countries. But, for example, in a country like the UK, childcare is completely privatized, so you don't have any public care like you have perhaps more in continental Europe. So this, I don't know exactly what's the situation here, but this means, for example, that I was looking into hire a nanny, and I wanted to pay her a proper wage, and all the insurances and health care securities and holidays, etc. It's, for me personally, I cannot afford that. It's absolutely impossible. It's really something that only a very wealthy family can do. And this is not because, this is just to say that this is due to the very system in which we are, in which childcare is so incredibly difficult and is so underpaid, etc. So I think one of the fundamental fights that we need to have is to have, for example, public universal childcare that is affordable for everyone, which is important not only for women who need someone to look after their children, but is especially crucial for the workers, because if you are employed within a public system, for example, you are more likely to have better working conditions. It's not taken for granted, and I want to talk about this more during the plenary, but it's also an issue about the workers. So to say very briefly, I think it's important that many white feminists face their contradictions when they actually have, the hire the migrant nanny or domestic cleaner, etc. I think it's important that they face the contradiction that they pay very little salaries for those. But I also think it's important that we don't demonize them, because the reality is we need to fight all together for a better system in which, these women can send their children, for example, to a public facility rather than having to sometimes rely upon the work of women because they are less expensive, and sometimes that's all you can afford. I hope this is clear. I think it's important to understand also these different nuances. And obviously the problem is also why are especially migrant women and racialized women who are doing these jobs. This is not, I also want to say this is not the case everywhere, because in the southern of Italy, I come from the south of Italy, and what we have seen in the last 10 years is that there are less and less migrant women doing the jobs of elderly carer or babysitter, for example, and more working class Italian women. And one of the reasons is the main reason, I would say, is the economic crisis. And obviously many migrants have been pushed out, and now we have lots of actually local non-migrant women who are doing these jobs. So I think it's also important to understand the class dynamics that are at work in all of this. Sorry if I'm a bit long. The crisis of these are very also important questions, so I'm trying to look at different angles. The crisis, what I meant by crisis of care, and I think I want to bring together the two questions you asked. And you asked me also if capitalism can emancipate white women, if I understood also your question correctly. I'll try to answer a little bit of this. What I meant by crisis of care. So I think here what I'm referring to is precisely the fact that capitalism, I think, is incompatible with what I just said, which is public universal care. And it is incompatible because as social reproductive work, capitalism does not want to pay for care, does not want to pay for the reproduction of labor power, because it would be too expensive, simply. And also, I think it's also important to look what are these jobs, because we are talking about, in the case especially of the service industry and the paid social reproductive jobs, we are talking about services that are extremely labor intensive and where the profit margins are very low, which is one of the reasons why until recently it was actually hard to see, for instance, many big companies investing in care, but usually care was, for instance, childcare or healthcare, education. They were increasingly, they were almost exclusively run by the state, precisely because, private, capitalists they knew they were not going to make much profit out of that. But this is actually changing at the moment, and this is a very interesting development. I don't know about Switzerland, but I can certainly see these in other European countries like France or Italy or the UK. Then is huge. You can see more and more big companies and corporations investing in care, especially elderly care, but also childcare. And the reason is that, these are still very labor-intensive industries and sectors, but the reason why they start to see the possibility of making profits is because the state is increasingly relinquishing its role as the direct provider of these services, and instead is subsidizing private provision. So instead of creating, as I said, public, affordable, not affordable, public actually, they should be free and public childcare settings, for instance, it's still, it is, for example, giving money to families and saying, oh, why don't you use this money to choose your own care provider, which is obviously creating what is one of the reasons why so many families also resort to migrant women, because the money they are given is not much. And so, for example, many migrant women have a lower wage as compared to other women. And the other reason is also very often the state is actually subsidizing these companies themselves. So it says, if you comply with these rules, with these regulations, I'm going to give you the money to open an elderly care facility or a childcare facility. So because of that, and because of all the tax evasion and the games that they do, they're actually making profits out of that. So we see more and more corporations investing. But that's exactly why I don't think capitalism is compatible with the type of social reproduction and care that we imagine, which is precisely public, which is free, which is shared amongst in the community, and so forth. And this is a huge contradiction of capitalism, and I think is also what is creating now this crisis of care, because we are at the limit of the, on the one hand, the state is not taking, is increasingly, as I said, getting rid of these tasks of public care, but on the other hand, capitalists cannot really do it properly, because the way they do it, what is it? By underpaying employers and by providing a bad service, because also this is detrimental to the quality of care, and therefore we are facing a crisis also for these reasons.